All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code podcast5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Emily Oster is a professor of economics at Brown University and the author of Expecting Better, Cribsheet, and The Family Firm. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard. Her academic work focuses on health economics and statistical methods. She is interested in understanding why consumers do not always make rational health choices. Why do people not eat a fully healthy diet or pursue all recommended preventative health behaviors? Her books analyze the data between choices in pregnancy and parenting, with Expecting Better analyzing the data behind many common pregnancy rules and improving decision-making for pregnant women. Cribsheet does the same for early childhood. What does the evidence really say on breastfeeding, co-sleeping, and potty training? And finally, her brand new book, The Family Firm, which we'll talk about today, takes this approach to parenting in early school years, looking at the data on school, extracurricular activities, sleep, and also providing a framework to make unexpected decisions, and addresses the logistical challenges of this period of parenting. I'm so excited this book came out before my kids were at the age of 5 through 12, but that's the sweet spot of what The Family Firm talks about and what we're going to dive deep into today. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. I thought it was awesome. Emily, thank you for being on the show, for writing another phenomenal book, The Family Firm. As I told you, I read it in a couple of nights, and it's awesome because I have a 2.5-year-old and an 8-month-old, and I feel like your books are, like I said, aligning with my child rearing and just coming out at the perfect timing for me. And this one did not disappoint. I'm so excited for my audience, and especially all the moms, to get their hands on this. It's so good. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah. So for people that don't know, your first book, Expecting Better, I read that when I was pregnant with, so funny because I read that book and you talk about miscarriage rate. And I actually had a miscarriage with my first pregnancy. And I was like, dang it, I'm a stat. Because it's good to know the data. I think it's important to inform ourselves, but I loved Expecting Better. And I loved Cribsheet. Their recommendations on my book list, actually, for my pregnancy course and for my under 4 course. So we're adding The Family Firm. And I want to jump into that because I think your first 2 books could be their own podcast. And we could deep dive that data another time. Sometime, yeah. Yeah. But let's talk about The Family Firm, because you have approached this book just like you would a business. You talk about looking at the big picture, creating a mission statement, having, priorities for your values and understanding yourself, and then making parental decisions based on that and those decisions. Can we talk about the big picture that you're talking about in the book and what it means to create a mission statement for your family?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the big picture sort of people kind of think about this idea of the big picture as like, what are your values, and kind of in this very almost abstract way. And I think for me, it's actually like much more in the details. So that's the way I talk about it is like your big picture is like, what should Tuesday look like? You know, maybe not every Tuesday, but like in general, your life is Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday. And so I think we fail to recognize the importance of the sort of small, like day-to-day pieces when we are thinking about how our family should operate. And so some of this big picture is actually like saying like, you should sit down and write down. I, by the way, like lean in so much in the book to the idea you should write things down, because I think there is so much value rather than just being, oh yeah, like on Tuesdays, I'd like to like, I don't know, I'd like to like see my kids for a little while. It's like when, during what hour? Like put down. And so this idea in the big picture is really to have some of these deliberate conversations about schedules and lifestyles and which things you want to prioritize. And is, dinner important to you? Is bedtime important? Or, is breakfast important? Or like, what are the things that you want to make sure that you are doing that are going to make you happy? And then building your schedule and then ultimately building your individual decisions around those priorities.
No, I love it because I think about, and we were talking about it before the show, like I played soccer. I played club soccer. My parents had no weekends. We didn't have that. When I had practice late, we didn't have dinner as a family, and it definitely impacted our day to day and their life. And I think what you did so beautifully in this book was allow for people to take a minute and say, like, what are my priorities? Can you give an example of your 3 priorities and how you start looking at decisions and making decisions based on those priorities for you and for your family?
I would say there's sort of 3 priorities. So one or maybe 2 things that are kind of really family time priorities. So one is dinner. I've said this before, like a time for our family to like really connect at the end of the day. And so that's a very important priority. We also have a pretty big emphasis on sleep and on the idea of like at bedtime. And that's gotten like a little bit more relaxed as the kids are like a little more flexible. But like as infants, we were the people who were like, I'm sorry, I know dinner has not been served, but we're actually leaving now because my kid has to be in bed. And I'm so sorry that you didn't take seriously that I told you I had to leave at 6:45.
Yeah.
And then I would say, the sort of third thing for us is like my husband and I both take our jobs very seriously and want to sort of be in a position where we can kind of like work during the day. And that is setting up structures in our family such that is going to be possible. And some of that means just like a lot of childcare when we need it. Those are kind of 3 big pieces, but in particular, the sort of first 2 pieces, even really the third, like you put those together, you've dictated like quite a lot of the day to day. If you've said, we're eating dinner at 6 and one of the kids is in bed by 7:30, like there's a lot that then, there's a lot that fits around that, but also there's a lot that doesn't fit around that. And I think that, that for us is formative in many, many, many choices.
I loved it. You gave an example in the book that you wouldn't allow your daughter to join a run club because it happened over dinner time. And I think that mission statement and those priorities, your values really created boundaries that you then held yourself accountable to.
And I think the other piece of it is really sort of trying to be on the same page with other decision makers, if it's a partner, if it's not a partner, but like just in general, sort of trying to agree on those things, because I think that the biggest sources of conflict that we're going to have in this sort of family structure are going to be when there is something very important to us and we don't agree on those things. And it is, of course, difficult to say them and then know that we're going to disagree, but it's even worse to not say them and then make decisions that are in, a contrast and then have to disagree. So I think we are reluctant to surface at home the kind of like uncomfortable conversations, but there's often a lot of value to doing so.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've seen this in your research, but that we're each raised differently and have priorities from the families that we're coming from. And they don't always align in our parenting techniques or how we raise our children. And so just having this out in the open, and I love all the workbook sheets in the book because it's like, let's create this mission statement. Like, what are our values? And you talk about priorities, like weekend priorities and weekday priorities and getting into the details, which is so good. But you also give people the tools to make decisions, and you call them the 4 F's. Can we go through those?
Yeah, of course. So the idea with the 4 F's is to say, you kind of have this sort of big picture schedule, so on. And then, but a lot of times there will be decisions that come along that like you're almost not sure how to approach, right? So like, I need to decide where my kid's going to go to school or whether they should do this activity or, and it's hard to know our way into that. And so this technique is sort of like a 4-step way into making some of these big decisions. And so the first piece is what I call frame the question. So actually say what the question is and not, should my kid go to school or should they go to this school? That's not actually a question. Should they go to this school or what? I think the biggest piece of the frame the question is people fail to fill in the or what. Should we do this or what? Or is it just not do it? Is it do something else? Like what exactly are you trading between? Because of course we can't make a decision unless we know what the choices are. The second step is what I call fact find. So figure out, is there some relevant data? And there's a lot of data in the book. There's data out in the world. Fact finding is also about logistics. Can we fit this in? Where would we fit in? Who would drive them there? Who would drive them there is like such a big thing in our family. Like who's driving who to what location? So you get whatever is the information that you need to make the choice. There's a final decision step. Really, and I think there the key is to say there should be a point at which you feel you have gotten the information, and then you should make a plan for a time to make that decision. Maybe you have a meeting, maybe you don't have a meeting, but that there's a sort of end point of this process rather than allowing the process to sort of like careen on indefinitely and sort of constantly rethink it, that there's like a time when you make a decision and then you made the decision and then you do the decision and then you move on, except this fourth step, which is follow-up, which is that for most of the decisions we make, there is an opportunity to remake them at some time in the future. But we are going to be able to take better advantage of that opportunity if we actually plan for it. If we say, okay, we're going to do softball this season. And at the end of the season or, in advance of the next season, we're going to plan to decide whether that was a good idea or not. I think the value of that is sort of twofold. Value of planning that, I think, is twofold. So one is, I was just talking to somebody who was like, well, after I make the final decision, then I'm just constantly thinking about whether I want to change it. Okay, that's not good.
Yeah, that's a lot of time.
That ruins the idea of moving on. But I think you can sort of say, oh, I don't have to do that because I've planned a time to think about it later. I'm not going to think about it now because I have a plan later for the time I will be thinking about that. And I think the other piece of the follow-up is that because we often want to have made the right choice, there's a sort of hysteresis in our choices. So I wasted all this time last year, like the last 3 years, the last 6 years doing, club soccer. And I don't want to be like, oh, that was dumb. I don't want to be like, oh, that was a mistake. And by choosing not to do it, you're kind of like saying, well, we shouldn't have done it. But if you've decided, well, we're going to reevaluate, then it somehow, I think, dials down emotionally a little bit. So that's it. Frame the question, fact find, final decision, follow-up.
I love it because you're giving people the tools to make a data-driven decision, to really clarify, like, what are they deciding against? What's the facts out there, which we'll dive into because you go into a lot of categories in the book. You do some fact finding for us, which I love.
Do a little bit.
A little bit. And then to make a final decision, what a relief. But then to follow up and make sure that's still aligning with what your mission is and what your values are. And like, how does it feel? You tried it on. I think a lot of times we make decisions and we don't really know, especially like career decisions. If people are young and they're like starting their career, they're like jump into a career and then decide, oh, this doesn't feel right once they're in it. Because you don't really know sometimes what things feel like until you're doing them. So the follow-up.
No, it's true.
I love that. Well, in the book, you go through a bunch of critical areas for raising kids. And can you clarify what this age range is for a family firm?
I think it's maybe, we're going to think about 5 to 12. So sort of like most of this is kind of school age discussion. And then it is sort of, I don't get into the kind of adolescence, puberty, teenage.
Book 4. Sorry.
My older one is only 10. And I asked the other day, she was like, are you going to write another book? I was like, I don't know. What do you think? And she was like, I don't think you can write about teenagers until we are teenagers.
Insightful.
Insightful.
Yeah. I love it. Well, you touched on a number of categories: sleep, nutrition, whether we should get childcare or work, parenting styles, which I thought was a really funny chapter title, helicopter, chicken, tiger, ostrich, school, extracurricular activities, feelings, and entertainment. And I love that you touch on nutrition and sleep, but what you do is you go into the data of all these categories and you give us some really meaty takeaways so we can make fact based decisions, informed decisions. It's like informed consent, thanks to Emily. Can we break down some of these categories and what some of your findings were? Let's start with one of your priorities, or both of them, which is family meals together. So nutrition and sleep, which obviously I'm obsessed with. So let's start there.
What do you want to start with?
Selfishly, either one's fine.
So should we start with nutrition?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stuff in the nutrition space. And I think there's sort of two big categories I think about here. So one is sort of like, what do your kids eat? And, and then sort of how do they eat? And I think the sort of family meal stuff kind of falls into how they eat space, and the kind of the more of this sort of nutrition science stuff kind of falls into sort of what do they eat? And I try to talk through a little bit of kind of both of those spaces.
Yeah. So let's talk about the what, because there's some data there. What did you uncover when it comes to what children eat and how it affects their growth and development?
So I would say sort of nutrition science is this, like it's hard to get causal evidence.
Yeah.
It's hard to separate out choices that people make about diet from like all of the other choices that they're making. And even sort of within diet, there's almost this kind of interesting pattern where like there's a very strong correlation with sort of a healthiness of like some concept of healthiness of diet or type of diet and various health outcomes. But it's almost impossible to say I could identify like a particular food, sort of the idea of like particular, like it's not that couldn't be true. It's just that we don't really have the data on it. So I think that means that sort of some of this nutrition science is a little murky. Right. Part of what's interesting though for kids is that we have a lot of evidence that tastes are formed in childhood. So if you sort of think about this as a frame, not of like, there is some optimal diet, or there's like a lot of, good, but rather in the frame of like, there may be some diet I think is good, or some way in which I hope my kids will eat. I want them to be adventurous, or I want them to be open to things. Maybe you don't care about that, but like, if you do care about that, childhood is a time in which those things are formed. And so if that is a priority, then it's worth thinking about like, how can I engage my kid in eating these things now so they will like them more later? And that's hard, right? I mean, I think that's like, it's not that there's no evidence on how to do it, but there's also the basic fact that like your kid likes mac and cheese.
Yeah.
They do. They like mac and cheese.
Right.
And they want to eat that. And but I think there is, so I would sort of highlight a couple of what I think is sort of interesting science-based sort of things about how you change diet. So one is that an issue people often have is they think their kid needs to eat more than they do. And that when sort of if you think about the idea of like, we're going to offer a family meal or a meal or whatever, however you do, you're going to offer some food. And if your kid doesn't like it, and then you make them mac and cheese every time, they don't have to be 5 years old. They can be 2 years old. Like they will learn that's how you get, they will learn that very fast. Now, if you're happy to have them have mac and cheese every time, that's fine. But if that isn't what you want, then there's a sort of like, you kind of have to push through, and you have to accept that some of the times they're not going to eat that much dinner. And that like, if your kid is sort of otherwise growing healthily, it is okay to occasionally not have as much dinner. That's
right.
Hard. Right?
Not to be a short order cook and make a secondary meal that I think, well, you're getting to a root fear for parents, which is that my kid is going to be hungry or starve, or that they're not going to grow. And I think you hit the nail on the head is that, a child's appetite changes so drastically based on the years of their life and how they're growing, but that not kind of giving in and offering a secondary meal. That snap of your finger was like, yeah, that's about how fast it takes for Sebastian to learn that if he's not going to eat, his protein and veggies, that I'm going to just offer like toast or something after the meal. Like that's just not going to happen, because he's smart enough to know that he could have toast every night. Like that's just going to happen. But I think what's also important is you touched on the flavor window, which is that period of time when kids are accepting of flavors. And it's so young. Like I'm with Tashin right now, being that he's 8 months old. I know I have like 10 months left to like get
10 months left. That's it.
I got to get all these flavors
get him in there.
And I just have to expose him to things. But I love
and multiple times, right? I think that's the other thing we see from the science that, particularly like a lot of kids, babies in that space will not like food when will sort of, not that they won't like it, but like it is the multiple exposures that is often helpful in sort of developing the taste. So if your kid doesn't like Brussels sprouts the first time, like you should try it again.
Right. Absolutely. Like exposure. And you gave some advice in this book about pairing flavors. So what should we do? Because if the flavor window's over, I mean, people are buying this book and their children are going to
The flavor window's
kindergarten.
done.
They missed the boat on that, but how can they continue to expose their kids to food and maybe increase the chance that they might like it?
Yeah, so I think that there's a thing that researchers call associative conditioning when they're trying to get kids to eat more vegetables, which is just like dip. Basically, it turns out, and that's like I love that because it's such a like researcher way to do it. It's like, what did you do in your experiment? Well, we experimented with associative conditioning. Sorry, what? We gave them dip. We had vegetables, and some of the vegetables had dip. And and it turns out that like if you sort of give kids vegetables with a dip that they like, that they will eat more of them, and that they will also they do that repeatedly, and then they will sort of eventually eat more of it. And particularly, there's sort of some subtlety there that like associated, I think, with the flavor window, that sort of for bitter vegetables, for younger kids, actually repeated conditioning, like just repeated offering, can be sufficient. For older kids, the dip is good for getting them to eat, to sort of try more of these bitter vegetables, because they've already developed a little bit of a sort of like a taste against that, and then they sort of can get into it. But I sort of like that because I think it's, it feels like a little bit of control, almost like a little bit of like something that you can do if you are, again, if you feel like, I wish my kid would eat more vegetables.
I love positive actions. Those are for me. Like, don't tell me I missed the boat and there's no chance for me. Give me an action step that I can do to create a positive association with these bitter vegetables. And I guess it's dip. We don't need to use the hard words. It's dip. That's the what. Now, can we talk a little bit about the how? Because you threw, one of your priorities is to have dinner with your kids. Can we talk about how, when we eat and how we're eating is impacting our kids?
The idea behind this sort of family meal, which has been like taken on this sort of like elaborate image in some people's mind, that like this is the end all and be all of everything. So in the data, there is a strong correlation between having a family meal or eating meals together and many good outcomes for kids, like, and particularly actually for older kids, sort of things like kind of behavior and performance in school and not drinking and this is kind of like a slightly almost like at the very tail end or even past the age that's focused on in the book, which is in general, like these correlations are really, really strong. But that's really difficult to interpret, because the characteristics that make it possible to sit down every night for a family meal at 6 are like really going to drive a lot of differences across families. And also because it's hard to do this, it like makes it even more, it makes it even more selected and even more unusual, but just even more of an important choice that people are doing in this deliberate way. And so, on the one hand, we sort of see all those correlations. On the other hand, it's hard to know whether that's causal or not. And I think that's kind of part of the challenge here. And part of why I think in that particular case, a lot of what people are going to choose, I think, is probably going to come down to like what they think is what they want to do and what is sort of possible. And I guess the other thing I would say about that data is, to the extent we think that those results are causal, that there's something about sort of being together in that way. It's not obvious that would have to be like dinner. Yeah. Right. And so I think for some people, it's like, well, I just can't, like, that's just not a thing that's going to happen. So I was talking to some people last night and, it was like I was doing like a webinar and there are two people on the webinar. And one of them, she was like, yes, we always have a family meal. And the other one, they like work together. So the other one was like, we never do that. Then she sort of described their evening, which was like, we feed our kids and then we like all hang out together and like talk to them about their day. And then we have dinner together. Well, like that's kind of exactly the thing that almost we're sort of trying to achieve, which is like that connection, the sort of like concentrated family time. It isn't clear you need to do that over a meal. I think for many people it's convenient because you're going to eat, but there are also challenges to it, like making a meal that everybody likes.
Right. I would say for me personally, I love to eat with my kids just because I like knowing also that I'm modeling that behavior, like modeling eating specific foods that they might not love, like not modeling mac and cheese, but like modeling those bitter veggies and like having them be a part of like making them and like really getting like exposure from cooking it to eating it together to all of it. But my husband is like one of those ladies on the webinar. He wants the kids to be sleeping so that he can actually taste his food and chew his food. And he's not like, picking something up off the ground and keeping a toddler in a chair. And like, I think that will change when our kids sit for a little bit longer, you know, but it is like important to me. So we've had this trade-off where I'm like, okay, cool. Like you can eat your like protein and the carby things that are offered, like the chicken and rice after dinner, but like the side salad and broccoli, like I need you to plate it and eat it with the kids. And like, we've kind of hit this like happy medium, but I think it is interesting that, I mean, it really, right. It's about the communication with your kids and like building that relationship and stuff. I love it.
It's sort of exactly as you say, it's about like you guys having a conversation where it's like, this is like my hill to die on. Yeah. Like basically like, this is really important to me. And like, I understand it's not your hill to die on, but like it's mine. And I'm not going to have infinity of those, but this is one. And you're putting the broccoli on your plate. And like, cause that's my thing.
Yeah.
And also to sort of recognize that you can say that. And I think this is like a little piece of the sort of data stuff for me that you can say that and say, it's not that I'm doing this because I necessarily think that like all of these studies that show that like, this is going to make my kid do whatever, like, it's not, it's because like, this is important to me.
Right.
And it's important to me because it's how I want to shape my life. It's like a thing that I want to do. That's enough for it to be a priority.
Right. Yeah. No, I think I have like, I don't have a laundry list of like things he needs to support me on, but like, that's that's one of my hills to die on. I'm also a mom who rips her kids out of a party to stick on schedule just because I live and die for sleep. And Chris loves to listen to podcasts and or YouTube videos on his phone with his earbuds and while he goes to sleep, and it drives me absolutely nuts because I'm like, screen time before bed, like you're killing your sleep. Like I can't have you do this. And so we, the trade-off is like, we're paying for YouTube Premium so that he's not streaming Wi-Fi in the bed because that's just like, I can't have it. Like it scares me and I don't have the data to support it, but I just am like, I want the phones actually out of our bedroom completely, but I'm willing to negotiate that part. But let's get into sleep for kids because that's what this is about, not for my husband. What does the research tell us when it comes to sleep and how important and critical it is for our kids, especially in adolescence?
Sleep is very important for our kids. And this is a place where I think the data is just really good. At least on the sort of basic idea that it is that alterations to sleep or having less sleep is bad. So for example, we have like RCTs with randomized controlled trials of kids and sort of like, I think the main one is kind of like 8 to 12. So sort of that kind of age range where what they did is they brought kids in sort of in like, and they did one of two things and they did them in sequence. So one is they had a short sleep condition where parents were told basically for like, for a week or 4 days, put your kids to sleep 1 hour later. So just 1 hour, like just put them to sleep 1 hour later. And then at the end of that week, they like did memory tests and asked the parents about their behavior. And those things are negatively affected. And this is like, we're talking about like 4 days of 1 hour less sleep. This is not, the kind of manipulations they do with adults where they like literally keep college students up all night. And that's also very bad. If you try to take a test having not gone to sleep, like you won't do well. Although interestingly, the college students think that they did better. That's the other thing that happens if they don't sleep. They think they did well, but they not. But for kids, these sort of smaller manipulations, really seem to matter. And I think that's informative for parents. And people want to follow and be like, well, how much, like, what is the right amount of sleep? And of course, that's actually, the kind of general guidelines for kids' school age, something like 9 to 11 hours, which is of course a lot more than most kids get. It's also a big range. And so I think that maybe you're like, well, we can't know anything, but actually we can. I think the key is sort of, you can tell if your kid is not getting enough sleep by like sort of, there are kind of two pretty concrete things. One is just, are they sleepy? Like literally, are they sleepy during the day? Are their teachers saying that they're sleepy? Do they seem not like just when they first wake up, everybody's sleepy, but like, if it's like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, are they like obviously tired? That's not good. That suggests they should go to sleep earlier. And the other thing is, do they oversleep on the weekends? So if you let your kids sleep on the weekend, would they go like 2 hours past their typical wake up time? That's not actually like a great sign for kids in this age range. Suggests that they're not sleeping enough.
That's an easy thing to test if you're a mom at home right now. Like let your kids sleep in on the weekend and then you'll know.
Yeah. So, people are saying as well, how would I know? It's like, this is like this is not, these things are not hard, particularly the last one, like just try it, try it, see what happens if you leave them.
I love it. Do you have a sweet spot for bedtime for your kids?
So my little one, my 6-year-old, so I have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old. So my 6-year-old goes to bed at basically lights out at 7:30, and then he's up at 7 or maybe 6:30 typically he's awake. So he's solidly in the 11 hours, and he is extremely good at sleeping. He's takes after my husband. He's like a high quality sleeper. You shut the door at 7:30, he's basically asleep. He's also an old man. So if we're ever walking around outside his room at 7:35, he's like, "Can everybody be quiet?" He's we're trying. He's I can still hear you. He's trying to ignore it.
Oh my God.
My older one, we've sort of pushed bedtime back, and she's kind of lights out at 9:15, but she spends a long time reading in her room before that. She takes after me. She's not a very good sleeper.
Which is also really fun if you're deep diving the data and you're oh no, your memory, your focus, your learning.
Yeah. I mean, it's more just that she has to be comfortable. She's got to she's not a person who just falls asleep anywhere. Whereas my husband and my son, they could just fall asleep anywhere. She and I are more we got to kind of have our
routine.
Gotta have our routine.
I love it. And you talk about building structure around sleep and having a routine for sleep. What's your routine for calming everybody down and getting them ready for bed?
With the little one, we have the same routine I think we've had almost our entire lives, which is after dinner, people maybe take a bath. Half the time they take a bath, half the time they don't. We brush our teeth, we read in the bed, and then, he reads a little bit to himself in the bed, and then it's kind of lights out. So it's a pretty abbreviated. The older one, the routine was always very long, and it's only gotten longer and longer. And so it's the same kind of she gets ready, whatever. And then I read to her for a while, which I still do, even though of course, she's a little big now. We're reading the Golden Compass series with Philip Pullman, just so fun. So I read to her for a while, for 15, 20 minutes. And then now she and I just hang out, and she reads while I work for a while, which is a very nice, it's such a nice time. Just sit in the family room and do our own thing. And then eventually she goes off and goes to sleep.
I love that though. It's kind of, you're getting that quality reading time in for her, but I can just imagine it just a sweet family room setting where everyone's calm. It's not a loud TV on in the background. It's just very
calming. It's a calming, and still she can't fall asleep because she's terrible sleeper, but
working on it.
I'm doing my best. Okay?
Yeah.
I'm delivering what I can.
I love it. Well, let's jump into some of your other topics, because I think, I know personally as a mom of a toddler, you talk about childcare and decision to work. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a working mom. I obviously carry a lot of mom guilt around that. And but it, like you, it is a priority for me. I'm fueled with passion working in this industry and helping people, and excited about it every day. So it is a pillar for me and a priority. Can you talk about some of the outcomes you saw when it came to is it detrimental? Is it good for kids? I think we have these ideas that it's.
Yeah, I think it's kind of not either. I think that the evidence is, we sort of dive into what happens, the sort of differences in outcomes, and in this case, I think we should just be clear, most of what we say for outcomes are things like test scores, right? Test scores and obesity are kind of the two things that we can measure. And then there's all kinds of stuff which I think of as important, and maybe you do too, around what am I modeling, and what are my kids learning about gender roles and kind of household, what are they learning, where I think that's an important part of this, but of course it's not in the data. But when we do look at something like test scores, I think that the kind of bottom line is there is unlikely to be much effect in any direction. It's very difficult to tease out, would it be better for one person to work full-time, part-time, two people, there's not much evidence in any of these directions. It's pretty mixed, but any effects that anybody has identified are extremely small. Okay. So in the scale of, what are the there are a lot of reasons to make different choices in this space. And this is probably not a major one. This is probably not a particular reason to choose any one thing over another. The place where there's, the evidence is like a little bit more, consistent, I guess, is the idea that sort of when both parents work, we do tend to see higher obesity rates in kids. And that's, again, a little hard to interpret with the causality, but it's much more consistent in the data. And I think part of that is you can sort of see a little bit of the mechanisms, which it tends to be like sort of kids they watch more TV, basically. They're like sort of afternoons are more sedentary. But I think recognizing sort of that mechanism is a way to think about that relationship and say, okay, like, one consideration in this space, if that's something that you're worried about, is to say, if both parents are going to be working outside the home, we want to, think about what the kids are going to do in the afternoon and maybe not have it be like watch television for the whole day.
Definitely. And you can think about like if someone else is taking care of your child, if you're leaving the children with like prepared foods or processed foods to make that easier on the caregiver. Like I think that, like you said, that those things, getting their body moving and having some prepared foods around would kind of alleviate that, it would seem like.
Yeah, exactly. To sort of like have, scaffold that a little bit and in a way that like that afternoon is not just in front of the TV.
So what can we talk about modeling? Because I think that is also a consideration that working parents don't think about, but I'd love for you to talk about.
In some ways, this overlaps a little bit with what we were saying about sort of family meal stuff, which is like we learn a lot from the experiences of our family, and we learn about the things we want to emulate. We learn about the things that we don't want to emulate. And I think sometimes we learn those things in ways that then, like, even if we don't think about them in the moment as like something that we want, that we sort of reflect on them later. I think about this a lot in the context of sort of working parents, and both my parents worked. And, I remember sort of moments of my childhood of thinking like, wouldn't it be nice if like my mom was like the kind of mom, was like home with cookie. I don't know what she, like, or was at more things, or, I didn't always have to, the thing in our house was like, always make sure you sign up for the paper plates for like the class party. So like you haven't signed up to like be the cupcake person.
Yeah.
And so, you sort of think like, well, what, why isn't my mom the one who makes cupcakes where you pull out the top of the cupcake and you put in the whipped cream and you put the top back on? Like, I want that mom.
Yeah.
But, when I reflect on it back as an adult, I'm so grateful for that modeling, because I think it has really influenced how I, the sort of way I think about my parenting. And also it has influenced my guilt, which is to say I don't have as much as I think that I would, because I sort of recall that. And I sort of think back on the cup, and it's like, what, that's like very silly. Like, in fact, this was like an incredible gift that she gave me. So I think that there is that sort of modeling piece that I think has long-term benefits.
Definitely. Well, because I would say that I had the whipped cream in the cupcake mom. Huh? And so I carry that. I'm like, that was amazing. I loved that. That was such a gift. What a sacrifice. Like, why am I can't give that to my kids, but I also am like, I can in the ways that I want to and what I find important. And I can't carry the guilt of knowing like I'm helping them grow in so many other ways and modeling a completely opposite role dynamic here in my home, where my husband stays home with our kids and I'm
Does he make cupcakes is he a whipped cream cupcake kind of dad?
No, I still think I'd have to make the cupcakes with whipped cream if we wanted them. But it is what it is. It is what it is.
It is what it is. No.
But it's just interesting what we learn from our parents, and which kind of brings me to our next topic, which is the parenting styles chapter, which I loved. And your nicknames for each of them. Well, can we talk through parenting styles? And because I think we all think we're just going to mess up our kids, and we read that the way we're doing it is wrong, and that we should be doing it a different way. Like,
it's true. I mean, so I think in some ways, like the big picture, I would say here is like, I think it's ridiculous to have the idea of there being these parenting styles, and that like you have to pick a type. And I think part of what I'm trying to like, the reason I'm trying to be funny in this title with the idea of the ostrich parent, where you just stick your head in the sand and like, it's just the sort of like the whole idea that we're somehow going to pick a type and that's going to be our parenting type, I think is not, we shouldn't have to do that. You should be able to sort of pick pieces from whatever, you just make decisions and not have to like be a thing with a label. And I think within that, I would sort of separate out there's this kind of like how much are you pushing your kids academically? And this is sort of gets in like the Amy Chua, like tiger parent thing. But for me, a much more important part of this parenting style, and something where I think there is a choice, is this question of sort of how much responsibility or independence are you going to give your kids, either sort of physical or in terms of like their responsibility. And that's a really important thing to think about in this age range, because, before your kid's about 5, there's kind of a limited amount of responsibility you can give them. I know this sort of Montessori space, like you can let them set the table and whatever, but like ultimately there's a lot of scaffolding for a toddler. Yeah. You're always going to be scaffolding your toddler a lot. And, when you have a 17-year-old, for better or for worse, like hopefully they're doing like a reasonable amount of things for themselves. But this era is a time in which, reasonable people are going to make different choices about what they ask of their kids and what they allow their kids to do. And so I sort of talk through some of that, not so much that we have a lot of particular data on what's the right thing to do, but just that it is really a place in which you want to make some deliberate choices about what choices you're going to give your kids.
Would you say that, I know you wrapped up the data and the outcome of like, there is a sweet spot between like over parenting and doing everything for your child and not stepping in and maybe being the ostrich and throwing your head in the I don't see it, I don't know, you do your own thing. How are you finding that sweet spot in your family? Can you give me an example of, because your children are at this age, like giving them independence, but also supporting them with what you might call scaffolding?
Yeah, so, I think the place where we have tried to, I'll tell you a place that we try to do this, that I would like, that I'm not very good at. And so, take it for what it is, which is like, we've tried to, one of the responsibilities we try to give our kids is to make their own breakfast. And sort of with the idea that like, basically they're old enough to do that. There are plenty of foods around, they're not required to like plan the breakfast, but like there's breakfast foods around. And the idea is like, you're supposed to come downstairs and like get your breakfast and eat your breakfast by the time like the end of the breakfast time is that we have to get ready for school or for camp or whatever. And so I think there's a sort of balance, like I'm scaffolding some of that, but then we are like, because we have like produced the breakfast, there is not like, you don't have to plan the breakfast, but you do have to produce the breakfast. And I think that's valuable because of course, like, I don't know, makes them do something for themselves. And then I don't have to make their breakfast. There's like some benefits and so on. But it is an example of something that I have an incredibly hard time doing. And I sort of talk about the idea in that chapter that like, when you are going to give somebody responsibility for something, you actually have to give them the responsibility. Like you can't be like constantly scaffolding them and being like, okay, I'm going to get the plate. Okay. Like, and I struggle with that so much. I like talk all the time. Always like, oh, okay, do you need like, what do you like? Okay, let's get, my husband's just like, stop talking. Like they're supposed to be doing this on their own. So, I think it's a place we have tried to get to a sweet spot where I think we're still like, the 10-year-old is pretty good. The 6-year-old,
it's a work in progress, right? Though, like it's like allowing for that independence. It's not when I am assuming only because Vash is so young that I, even just saying like, oh yeah, climb the jungle gym by yourself. And I'm trying to give him that independence, but also not be like hovering to like not let his body fall. And that's a little bit more dangerous example than breakfast.
No, but some of this is like my 6-year-old wants to make eggs. Like some of this is a question of like, how much access to the stove do you give to your 6-year-old? And like, he can do it. There is a sort of jungle gym moment of like, okay, like I definitely don't want him to burn himself.
Right.
And so I have to be careful, but also, I don't want to hover because I think he is capable of doing it. And there's sort of like a lot of pride in that kind of independence. And then he will get better at it, the next time. He used to be worse. Now he's a little better.
No, I love it because I'm sure you're the one deep diving this data, but it's like their ability to be resilient, their independence, their just, their confidence, decision-making, like all that stuff, to think that, not letting them climb on the jungle gym without holding your hand or like make eggs in the kitchen for breakfast, but it's playing into their life experiences that then, they go out into the world and
you're gonna have to make their own eggs.
And they're all,
that's like you gotta leave. This is, I think about this cooking stuff a lot because like eventually you're gonna be living some ability to boil water and like make pasta does seem like a sort of useful.
Yeah. That's like, I feel safe in that space. So when we have all the kids' knives around and like we are, but there is a part of me that's like, that is not the way you cut a tomato, but that chunk will work. We'll just throw it in.
When my son made the veggie plate the other night, and like, it was like, oh, that's amazing. But of course it doesn't look exactly like it does when the babysitter makes the veggie.
It's okay. It's okay. Well, let's jump into a couple of other topics. I know we're running out of time, but I think it's just so important for people to have that idea of the big picture, like what's important to them and their family, being able to make those fact-driven decisions and like be done with the decision. Follow up, put it on the calendar, do your thing. But all these topics you're talking about, sleep, nutrition, like what are your non-negotiables? Like what is your schedule? What is the structure? It's running your family like a business and having strategy and having clear to-do lists, basically, of like, this is what we're going to do every day and this is what's going to work. So you talk about, we can put these kind of two topics together, but like school and extracurricular activities, like how are we really making these decisions and how important are they that our kids are doing all the extracurricular activities and in the best school at a specific time in their life? Like if these feel like huge, big decisions, and are they?
Yeah, I mean, yes, your kid spends a lot of time at school. And so sort of choosing a school in a thoughtful way to the extent that you have a choice, I think that is a decision that deserves some, attention. So I think it's not something where it's just like, okay, I'm just not going to think about this. I think it is a sort of important decision, but I think it's also worth remembering, like your kid also spends a lot of time with you.
Yeah.
And that, there's a kind of like, if we don't want to overstate the importance of school as like, that's not the only thing that they do. It's an important thing, but it is also, only a part of their day. And there's a sort of like family piece of this. So there's a tension there between recognizing how important that decision is, which is very important. And then also recognizing that like, there are other factors and other things about you. And I think recognizing that does in some ways sort of shape choices, because for example, like if you think about like, say I'm choosing between, a school that is, close to me and a school that is an hour away. And maybe the school that's an hour away, like has a little better test scores or a little better, some fancier gym, whatever it is. But that hour, like that's meaningful in other ways for your family. And it may mean less time with you. It may mean like less time sleeping. So I think that we can sort of get into the idea that school, like the best school is like somehow like, that's like, we want to be maximizing some school quality metric of some nature. But in fact, like, it's not the whole thing. It's not the only thing. And I make a sort of similar point or version of that point about extracurriculars, which is that it has become so pre-professional. The idea, I mean, I was just talking to somebody, like the thing I did before this was the guy who was like, well, but like one of the things we think about here in California is like, I can't even believe this, maybe he was making this up, but it was like, you think about in California, like if your kid does lacrosse, like there's not a lot of lacrosse players from California. So like that might be a good way to get into like an Ivy League East Coast school because like, oh, like that's probably not a good reason. Like that kind of, but this sort of pre-professionalism of that has pervaded this kind of extracurricular space in a way that I think is probably not great. Not great. Particularly because all the evidence we have about extracurriculars, all of the like things that we have that suggest that extracurriculars are good, is all around sort of extracurriculars as like a way to connect with a different peer group. So it's not that like extracurriculars don't matter. Actually, there's a lot of good evidence that extracurriculars are good for your socio-emotional health. Good for the fact that like if you feel like school's not really working for you, it's nice that like you can go to the soccer team and be like, hey, here's a thing that like I'm really good at and like I really like, or it's a different set of people. And I think that has a fair amount of good evidence behind it. This sort of idea of extracurriculars as a way to generate belonging and belonging being important for our mental health and so on. But that's like the reason to have your kid do lacrosse, because they like the lacrosse team, not because like Harvard's like short a center,
I mean, it is true though, because when I was at USC, the girls on my hall were all crew players. And a lot of them were like, yeah, my parents put me in crew because there's not a lot of people who do crew on the West Coast. And I could get a scholarship and get into USC with a crew scholarship because there just isn't the competition that you see on the East Coast.
Yeah. And I think, it's also, but like at least there, they probably didn't start doing crew until high school. Yeah. Right. So if you sort of said like at the beginning of high school, I have to choose between these sports And this is what, like, at least then you're kind of closer to the decision. This is like, we're talking about like, should my kid do travel soccer in the second grade? Because of like, yeah, that feels like that's a long way. That's a long way to USC.
Right. And if you're and I'm curious if the data teased out like a lifer, like I played soccer my whole life. My middle sister, she played soccer. She did ice skating. My parents were like, we don't care what you do, but you have to be in a sport or an extracurricular activity every single year. So it's fine if you do volleyball 1 year. And by high school, she stuck with volleyball like through all 4 years or 3 of the 4. But does it matter if someone is switching or sticking with something for the long haul? Or
no. I mean, I think, or at least certainly not in the data. In the data, it's really all about sort of like the idea of the extracurricular. And I think it is true if your identity gets into could be a value of saying like, I'm identifying with this group, or this is my peer group in some way. And so that would argue for sticking with it for those reasons, but not for the reason of like, that's because then you're going to be a professional.
Yeah. And how many of us are actually playing collegiate sports or becoming professionals? I think
no, not many. That's a small number.
Yeah. So it should be just for fun and getting these kids outside anyways. Let's get to the most important part, in my opinion, which are the last couple chapters on feelings and entertainment. In the entertainment one, you talk a lot about screen time and when should my kid have a phone, which I don't even want to like get to that decision, to be honest with you. I'm like, I am hoping, and Chris and I talk about this, that by the time our kids are old enough that they're going to think like, wow, social media was so stupid, and screen time, like I want to read real paper books. Like they're going to just be cooler than us and not
just
be
like how I
interested
wish when my kid is 16, there's going to be like self-driving cars. So that's like my dream. I don't think things are going great on that. Actually, she's already 10, but
Yeah. But I think these are like, I mean, obviously feelings being like how we feel and how we interact with the world, and like all of that, I think being the most important. But can we touch into the last 2 topics before time is up? Because I know you're very popular.
Yeah. I mean, so I think that the feeling stuff, I really sort of wrote about kind of like how kids develop empathy, but then also how we sort of think about scaffolding social problems. Because I think that one of the things, that inevitably happens with your kids, and is I think one of the things that is most challenging as a parent to react to is like, if my kid is being bullied, is themselves like sort of somehow figuring out how we navigate that and how we support our kids. Because you can't, I mean, it sort of gets back to the independent stuff. Like you can't just like show up at their school and like shame the other children, even though you totally want to, or shame that, like, that's not like, it's just not going to help, And so the question is sort of, what can we do at home? Like, what do we know that we could do in our homes that would support our kids in that thing? And I think some of that is just, being an environment that is safe, right? That like when we look out at the data about sort of among kids, there's some data on like among kids who are being bullied, what is correlated with particularly bad outcomes for them. I mean, nobody likes to be bullied, but what is correlated with that turning into bad like mental health issues? And some of it is about sort of not having the support at home, or rather that like resilience is delivered by having more of a support system at home, by sort of feeling that home is a safe place. And so I think for me, that was a lot of what I took away from that literature, was that like kind of the thing I can do the best on those dimensions is just be a place of safety. And then, understand that like sometimes people are going to be mean, and that like totally sucks.
Yeah. How are you making your home a safe place, other than obviously like you're providing a shelter, you're there for your kids? Like, is there structure in the safety that you're creating at home?
I mean, I think some of it is thinking about this piece of extracurriculars, like what are the things that they can do outside, and are those things going to serve them in this way? And that's not really about home, but that's sort of about other things. But I think the other piece is just like always being there in a consistent manner. I don't think there's any sort of secret to like what you're doing. This is part of why we have dinner. This is part of why we try to spend time with our kids. And just to sort of say, like this is a place of some safety.
I love it. Open communication, being there, spending time, quality time together. They know they can count on you for the long haul.
I hope so.
Let's end today with the phone, because like I mean, I didn't have a phone until I was a senior in high school, and it was taken away like 3 months later because I, used all the minutes times like 5, texting and calling all my friends. I don't even remember if I was texting. I had a beeper first for like a hot minute.
Beeper, nice.
Yeah, 143. And then I had the phone, and then the phone was taken away, like literally in a very short amount of time. And I went to college with one of those, that was like really my first phone, one of those Sprint handheld walkie-talkie style phones, because my dad owned a business where all his workers were on walkie-talkie phones. So occasionally I'd get walkie-talkied in like Riding 101 freshman year in college from like, a trucker. So that was cool. But it was never a smartphone. It was never social media. It wasn't, how do we make this decision? And what is the research saying?
There's a sort of piece of the phone that I think we could actually separate from the social media stuff, which is like, there could be reasons to get your kids like a walkie-talkie phone or like a flip phone, because actually it is helpful to be able to contact them. And so I think sometimes people wrap those decisions up, like my kid wants a phone and also I like them to be able to call me. Well, actually those are pretty separate decisions. Like you can give them a way to call you that does not have Instagram. They still make those. I know because we have one. And so I think we sort of separate that out. But when we get into the question of sort of these phones with Instagrams and I think that there's, the research is a little conflicty in the sense that there is some sense in which kids can use this to connect in ways that are productive. So sort of, again, like if things are difficult at school, if there's a particular peer group you want to connect with, like, this can be an avenue into making sort of better relationships or having more secure relationships or whatever it is. And I think that's kind of good. And then at the same time, there's this, there's the kind of FOMO piece of this and the fact that we do see correlations between what they call excessive social media use and, depression and FOMO and other things like that. And how much of that is the fault of the social media and how much of that is, the venue for those. How much of that is like the sort of the mood is causing the social media use versus the social media use causing the mood? I think it's a little bit of a complicated dynamic. This sort of trade-off feels to me almost like this in sort of new parenting, that there's this sort of like when you are a new mom or a new parent in general, there is a nice thing about things like Instagram where like, or the internet where like you can find people who are having those experiences at exactly the same time and like connect with them in the middle of the night. And like, someone else is also like Instagram storying that their boobs are leaking. That's kind of like, there's like something so supportive. And then there's also the like fit moms. There's nothing wrong with fit moms, but like, there's also sort of the images that you see where sort of things are being presented in Instagram way. And, there's like, I just had my baby, but like, I look great and I'm out and I'm doing things. And you're like, why is that not me?
Yeah.
And I think that those appear in their own way in the kind of teenage social media world as well.
Yeah, it's the highlight reel. It's the snapback of that postpartum snapback. And it's like, that's not the whole story. They're still being thrown up on and having engorged boobs and night sweats. And they might just not be putting it on Instagram like other people.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I think, when you sort of reflect on that, then there is still this decision to make. But I think that having a sense of that kind of tells you that like, probably phones are good in some ways and bad in others, and exactly where your kid is going to fall is going to depend a lot on your kid. And it is also an argument, I think, for this idea of follow-up. So you sort of said you had your phone for 3 months until you used all your minutes. There's a world of a sort of like planned 3-month trial period where you sort of say, okay, like, let's do this, but then let's see how we feel about it at the end of 3 months. Let's sort of like, not in a punitive way, not in a, like, I'm going to, if you use all your minutes, let's take your phone away, but in a kind of like, let's see how this is making us feel. Like, are we like, has this become too big a part of our life? Do we need to take a break? Are there some limits we want to put on it? And I think that's a reasonable approach there.
I love it. It's following the 4 F's and following up and making sure it works for your family and creating some structure around it if it's not. So how are you allowing your kids to use phones, or probably just your daughter?
My daughter has a flip phone because she wanted to walk to the library by herself. And it's like a little bit further than we would want without her having a phone. So we got this phone as a result of that desire.
I like it. So she can call.
Yes.
Okay.
And she basically never, and then we turned out we use it for a few other things like that. Like if we drop, like the kids go to camp and for whatever reason, we like drop them earlier than the camp opens. It's not very far away, but we drop the two kids together. And so she's like in charge of her brother for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, whatever, until camp starts. And so we typically give her phone, like just in case because of that experience. So we've sort of used it a little bit like that, but she doesn't use it for social stuff.
I love it. So wrapping this up in a big bow, what advice would you have for parents who have children in the same, in that 5 to 12 year range? What would you say are kind of like the non-negotiables that you've taken out of the data?
So I think in terms of taking out of the data, I would say sleep is important as a sort of non-negotiable. And by the way, the one thing that's sort of crystal clear about the sleep is you should not use screens before bed. Like your kids should not be watching TV like instantly before they go to bed. It actually really affects their sleep. So I think there's that's like one pretty concrete like data thing that is, I think, actionable. And then I think the other thing I would say is sort of on the screen stuff, like some is probably okay, or some is okay. And there's a sort of balance there about how much, but I think some people sort of end up in a place where it's like all or nothing. It's like, that's a particular case where there's a kind of happy medium of like some screens are fine. And when it becomes the entire day, it's a problem.
Yeah. For kids and adults. Let's be honest.
For kids and adults.
Emily, this was so fun. I loved having you on the show. I love all your books, as I said before. Thank you for teasing out the data for us and helping all the moms out there make it through all of it, from pregnancy to raising adolescents. I'll be looking forward to, fingers crossed, a 4th book for teenagers. All
right. Well, you have a little time. So yeah. I have some time to produce. I'm a little bit ahead of you. So
okay, good. I love it. Well, thank you for your time. I will put links to the family firm in show notes, but where can people follow along?
You can find me, the easiest place is my Parent Data Substack. So it's emilyoster.substack.com. It's called Parent Data. It comes out twice a week. It's a newsletter. I write about these things. I write about stuff from the books. And anyway, that's the best place to get me.
Good. I will also link to your Instagram because you're a fun follow, and make sure people are following along there too. Thanks again. This was awesome. I have my workbook. I'm like going to get with Chris this weekend and create a mission statement.
Your mission statement. Yeah.
Yeah. I started to write down my priorities. I was like, I definitely want to a meal with my kids, obviously, like getting them outside. And then for me, it's like work and workout. So I have 4 priorities. So I don't really, it's not too many, right?
It's not too many.
Okay. I'll separate it between weekday and weekend priorities, and we'll be good to go. Oh, Emily, this was awesome. Thank you for all of your work and for being on the show.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.